I've seen hell, and it's not what you think. There are no flames, no pitchforks. There's just nothing. A cold, silent, suffocating darkness where the only thing you can feel is the weight of every terrible thing you've ever done. It's a prison made of your own regrets. And I know this because I built my own cell, brick by brick, and locked the door from the inside. But before all that, I was a king. Not the kind with a crown, but the kind with something far more valuable: control. My life was a fortress of polished marble and bulletproof glass perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. From the outside, I was just a businessman, incredibly wealthy, untouchably private. But on the inside, in the rooms where powerful men knelt before me, I was something else entirely. They didn't come to me for business advice, they came for solutions. A political rival who needed to disappear, a business competitor who had to be ruined. They brought me their desperation in briefcases, and I gave them what they wanted. My power wasn't in stocks or real estate. It was ancient, dark, and absolute. I had everything a man could ever want: cars that cost more than most people's houses, a staff that answered before I even asked. I could make a phone call and shatter a family 1,000 miles away. I was a god in my own little kingdom, and my word was law. But there was a problem. A new brand was moving into my territory. It was a faith that spoke of a different kind of power, one that didn't demand payment or sacrifice, but offered forgiveness. It started small, a few people singing in a dusty village, then a small church, then another. They spoke of a man named Jesus, a carpenter from a forgotten corner of the world. And they weren't afraid of me. That I couldn't tolerate. Fear was the currency of my empire. One day they came right to my front gate. A small group led by a young pastor who couldn't have been more than 25. He looked me right in the eye, with no fear at all, and said they'd come in peace to talk to me. I just laughed. I remember the look on his face when my guards grabbed them. It wasn't anger, it was pity. He looked at me with all my wealth and all my power, and he felt sorry for me. As they dragged him away, he said something I'd never forget: "May God have mercy on your soul." That was the last straw. Mercy was for the weak. I decided this pest problem needed a permanent solution. I wasn't just going to push them out, I was going to erase them. I was going to wipe the name of their God from the entire country. And I put a price tag on it: $1 million. Before the fall, my life was a perfectly arranged photograph. Every day was the same. I'd wake up before the sun, the air in my bedroom chilled to a precise 68 degrees. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed me the ocean, gray and sleeping, and for a moment I'd feel like I owned that too. My staff moved like ghosts, placing my coffee black, no sugar on the marble countertop without a word. They knew better than to speak unless spoken to. Fear, I had learned, was the most efficient form of management. My world was built on a simple, brutal truth: everything and everyone has a price. Power wasn't about respect or loyalty. It was about knowing that price and having the means to pay it, or more often making someone else pay it. I saw people as instruments. Some were scalpels for precise, quiet work. Others were hammers for when subtlety wasn't necessary. I never had friends, only assets. The men who came to me with their tailored suits and their sweat-beaded brows weren't my partners. They were customers, buying absolution for their greed and ambition in the form of services. I'd listen to their pathetic problems, take their money, and then forget their faces. They were just numbers on a balance sheet. You might think a life like that, surrounded by so much luxury, would be fulfilling. You would be wrong. There was a hollowness inside me that was as vast and cold as the bottom of the ocean I looked at every morning. I could buy anything I wanted, but I couldn't buy a single moment of real peace. At night, after the phone calls were made and the fates of men were sealed, I'd sit alone on my balcony with a glass of scotch that cost more than a family's monthly rent. The silence in that mansion was deafening. It was the sound of a life without love, a soul without a purpose. I had everything, and it all amounted to nothing. I tried to fill that void, of course. I bought faster cars, bigger diamonds, more influence. I thought if I could just get more control, if I could just silence every voice that wasn't my own, then maybe the quiet inside me would finally go away. It was like trying to fill a black hole with dust. The more I threw in, the bigger and emptier it became. I didn't have relationships, I had transactions. I didn't feel joy. I felt the temporary thrill of a successful power play. My heart was a stone. I knew something was deeply, fundamentally broken inside of me, but I had no idea what it was. How could I? I was the king of a kingdom made of shadows, and I was its only prisoner. But then I heard their singing. It was faint at first, carried on the wind from the village below. It was a sound that didn't belong in my world. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't greedy, it wasn't fearful, it was joyful, and it made my skin crawl. This was the brand I told you about. This faith. It represented everything I wasn't, a power I couldn't buy or intimidate. I saw it as a sickness, a weakness that had to be cut out before it could spread. I convinced myself that this was the answer to my emptiness. A new enemy to conquer, a new force to bend to my will. I was wrong. This wasn't just another business deal. This was a war one had declared on an enemy I couldn't see. And I had no idea that in trying to silence the name of God, I was about to make him shout my name so loud it would wake me from the dead. What do you think drives a person who has everything to feel so completely empty? If you want to hear how this war truly began and the first price I had to pay, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. I'll be sharing more stories you won't believe in the next video. My $1 million campaign was working. I was strangling their hope, $1 at a time. Every morning my assistant would bring me reports. A church in the north shut down for code violations, a pastor in the south arrested on trumped-up charges. The news painted them as a fringe cult, a public nuisance. My money was a poison, and it was spreading perfectly. The singing from the village had stopped. I had bought myself silence, and it was the most satisfying sound in the world. I thought I was winning. I had no idea the real war hadn't even started yet. The first sign was so small I almost missed it. A tremor in my right hand as I lifted my glass of scotch. I dismissed it. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. Then came the fatigue. It wasn't the normal kind of tired. It was a deep, heavy exhaustion that settled in my bones, a weight I couldn't shake. I, who could work for 2 days straight and feel nothing, suddenly needed to sit down after climbing a flight of stairs. I saw it as a weakness, an insult to the control I had over everything, including my own body. So I did what I always did with things I didn't like. I ignored it, believing I could will it away. But then came the warning I couldn't ignore. It happened in my ritual chamber, my sanctuary, the very source of my power. I was performing a rite for a client, a simple curse to bankrupt a competitor. I lit the candles, drew the symbols, and spoke the ancient, guttural words that had always made the air crackle with energy. But this time, nothing. The air remained still and dead. The familiar cold presence I would summon, the one that answered to my commands, wasn't there. It felt like I was screaming into a void. For the first time in 20 years, the abyss didn't answer back. A cold dread, colder than any spirit I had ever summoned, washed over me. The power line had been cut. But who or what had the authority to do that? The real terror, though, came a few days later. I was in a meeting with a corrupt government official, one of my most useful puppets. We were sharing a laugh, celebrating the closure of a string of small churches he had arranged. He raised his glass to toast our success. As I lifted mine, a pain shot through my side. It was so sharp, so sudden, it felt like a hot knife twisting under my ribs. The breath was stolen from my lungs. I saw spots dance in front of my eyes. Somehow I kept my face a perfect mask of calm. I even managed a tight smile. But my hand gripped the arm of my leather chair so hard I thought the wood might crack. He didn't notice a thing. He just kept droning on about our victory. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just a random pain, this was a response. My declaration of war had been received. That night's sleep offered no escape. I dreamed I was standing on the balcony of my mansion, but it wasn't the ocean in front of me. It was an endless, suffocating darkness, completely silent and empty. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned to see the young pastor I had humiliated. He wasn't angry, he just had that same look of pity on his face. He pointed into the blackness and said, "You built a kingdom of nothing to fill your own emptiness. Soon you will have all the nothing you could ever want." I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs, the sheets soaked in a cold sweat. It wasn't a dream. It felt like a prophecy. But what happened next was even worse. A sane man would have seen these signs, the failing body, the silent spirits, the prophetic nightmare, and stopped. He would have taken it as a warning. But I wasn't sane. I was arrogant. I interpreted it all as an attack. This God, this faith I was trying to erase, was fighting back from the inside. And my pride, the very foundation of my entire life, refused to be beaten. So I went to my office, my hands still shaking, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I called my banker. I was going to unleash hell. I was going to double the budget, triple it. I would burn it all to the ground until not even the memory of their God remained. I thought I was launching my final, decisive assault. In reality, I was just buying a front row seat to my own execution. What do you think is scarier, a monster you can see, or a power that dismantles you from the inside out without ever showing its face? If you want to know what the doctors told me and how my own power completely abandoned me in my darkest hour, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The next part of this story is where everything truly fell apart. The doctors finally ran out of expensive words. "There's nothing more we can do," they said, their faces a mixture of professional sympathy and quiet relief. They could finally wash their hands of the man whose money couldn't buy a cure. My staff, the ones who used to tremble if my coffee was a degree too warm, now scurried past my bedroom door, avoiding my eyes. Fear, it turns out, has an expiration date, and mine was stamped all over my failing body. My magnificent house, once a fortress of my power, had become my tomb. I lay there in a bed that cost more than a car, and the silk sheets felt like they were woven from sandpaper against my thin, brittle skin. The pain was a constant, a low fire burning in my gut that no drug could extinguish. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. It's the deafening, absolute silence from the other side. The spirits and entities that had been my servants, my weapons, were gone. I had screamed for them, begged them, offered them everything I had left. They had abandoned me. The rats had fled the sinking ship. I remember staring at the ornate gold leaf on my ceiling, a pattern I had chosen myself to signify wealth and permanence. It just looked cheap, a gaudy lie. I, Kellen, the kingmaker, the destroyer of men, couldn't even command my own cells to stop their rebellion. My breath became a chore. Each inhale was a shallow, rattling thing. Each exhale a sigh of defeat. The world began to shrink, the sharp edges of my million-dollar furniture softening into blurry shapes. The distant sound of the ocean, the one I used to believe I owned, faded into a dull hum. This was it, the end of the game. My final thought wasn't one of regret for the lives I had ruined. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was pure, undiluted pride, a final act of defiance. I gathered the last wisp of air in my lungs, the final spark of energy in my dying body, not for a prayer, but for one final curse. I was going to spit in the face of the God who had done this to me. I formed his name on my cracked lips, a word full of venom and hate. And then, a click. It wasn't a sound from the room, but a sound inside my own head. A switch being flipped. The connection to the world, to my body, to life itself severed. One moment I was feeling the rasp of the sheets and the fire in my side, the next nothing. The pain was gone. But so was everything else. The light, the sound, the sensation of touch. I wasn't in my body anymore. I wasn't anywhere. I was just consciousness, floating in a cold, silent, suffocating blackness that went on forever in every direction. It was the purest form of alone you can imagine. The young pastor was right. I had built a kingdom of nothing to fill my emptiness. And now I was its sole inhabitant, eternally. What do you believe is waiting on the other side when a life built on power and darkness finally ends? If you want to see what pierced that eternal darkness and hear the first words God ever spoke to me, you need to subscribe and hit that bell. The conversation that changed everything is coming up next. There was no tunnel, no white light, no replay of my life flashing before my eyes. There was just a disconnect, a clean, silent snap like a thread breaking. One moment I was Kellen, a dying man in a silk-sheeted prison. The next I wasn't. I was just aware. I had no eyes, but I could perceive. I had no ears, but I could sense the silence. And the silence was a thing, a physical presence. It was heavier than water, colder than a tomb. I was floating in an infinite ocean of nothing, and the only thing in it was me, my thoughts, my regrets. For how long, I don't know. Time doesn't exist in a place like that. It could have been a second or a billion years. The feeling was the same, eternal, crushing loneliness. But I wasn't just alone. I was accompanied by every single act of cruelty I had ever committed. It wasn't like watching a movie. It was worse. I was forced to feel it. I felt the terror of the man whose business I destroyed, the gut-wrenching grief of the wife he left behind. I felt the shame of the politician I blackmailed, the hollow ache in the hearts of the missionaries I'd had beaten and thrown in the dirt. It was an endless, looping symphony of pain, and every note was a sin I had composed. This wasn't a punishment being inflicted on me. This was me. My soul was made of this darkness, and I was trapped inside it forever. And then, something changed. It started not as a light, but as a sound. A single, pure note, like a distant bell ringing in a vacuum. It was a sound that had no business being in that place of absolute silence. It vibrated through the nothingness, and for the first time in that timeless void, I felt something other than my own despair. I felt curiosity. The note grew, not in volume but in presence, splitting into a harmony that began to push back against the suffocating weight of the darkness. What happened next was the first true miracle I had ever witnessed. A pinprick of light appeared in the distance. It wasn't the harsh, accusatory light I would have expected. It was warm, golden. It didn't burn the darkness away. It absorbed it. As the light grew, expanding like a sunrise in a universe that had never known a sun, the torment began to fade. The phantom pains of my victims eased. The crushing weight of my regrets lifted. The light washed over me, and it felt like a pardon. It felt like peace. And in the center of that beautiful, terrifying, all-consuming radiance, I felt a presence. An intelligence so vast it made my entire life of power and influence look like a child playing with stones in the sand. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't male or female. It wasn't a sound that traveled through air because there was no air. It was a thought, a feeling, a truth that bloomed inside my very consciousness. It was both a whisper that only I could hear, and a thunder that shook the foundations of that eternal place. And it said one word. My name, Kellen. What do you think you would feel hearing your name called by God after a lifetime spent fighting him? If you want to hear the first conversation I ever had with my Creator and the impossible choice he gave me, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. You are not going to want to miss what he said next. That one word, Kalen, it wasn't spoken in anger. It wasn't a judgment, it was a reclamation, like a man calling the name of something precious he thought was lost forever. The sound of my own name, spoken by that voice, was the first act of grace I had ever known. It didn't just break the silence. It shattered the very foundation of my eternal prison. The darkness that was me recoiled from it like a creature of the night from the first rays of dawn. The light, that warm golden sunrise, wasn't just something to see, it was something to feel. It had a texture like liquid warmth, and it poured into the empty spaces inside of me, filling the void I had spent my entire life trying to stuff with power and money. And in the heart of that living light, I felt the source of the voice. I still couldn't see a shape, no old man on a throne. It was far bigger than that. It was an awareness that was in everything, a consciousness that knew the number of atoms in the universe and the real reason for the tears I cried as a boy. Then he showed me my life, not like a movie. It was so much more intimate, so much more terrible than that. I was suddenly inside the mind of the young pastor as my guards dragged him away. I felt the sting of the mud on his face, but more than that, I felt the deep aching sorrow in his heart, a sorrow that was for me. I felt the panic of the family whose lives I'd shattered with a single phone call. I felt their hunger, their fear, their hopelessness. It wasn't a punishment, it was an education, a lesson in empathy delivered with the force of a tidal wave. For the first time, I saw the true cost of my kingdom written in the currency of human suffering. I wanted to scream, to apologize, to tear myself apart for what I had done, but there was no voice, no body. There was only the light, holding me in this state of perfect, agonizing clarity. And then the voice spoke into my mind again, answering the question I hadn't even formed. I am the God you spent $1 million to banish, it said, the thought blooming in my consciousness without a sound. I am the father of the ones you persecuted. You declared war on me, Kellen, but they declared a different kind of war. They fought for your soul. Their prayers for you reached my throne long before your threats ever did. That was the moment everything broke. Their prayers, they were praying for me. The people I had tried to destroy were trying to save me. The logic of my entire life, a world of transactions, of power, of enemies and assets, crumbled into dust. It made no sense. It was a grace so profound, so unearned, it felt like a violation of the natural order of things. And then he showed me the centerpiece of this impossible truth. An image formed in the light. A man nailed to a cross of rough wood. His body was torn, his face bloodied, but his eyes were locked on me, and there was no anger in them, no condemnation. There was only a love so deep, so powerful, it was terrifying. It was the face of the Jesus they spoke of, and I knew with a certainty that went deeper than bone that he was seeing me, Kellen, the sorcerer, the monster, and he was dying for me. That love was a fire that burned away all the lies I had ever believed about myself, about power, about my own worthlessness. Your life of power is over, the voice said, its tone now carrying the weight of a divine decree. But your time in darkness is also over. I am raising you from this prison, not for you to return to who you were, but to become who I created you to be. The power you chased in the shadows is nothing. I will give you a new power, the power of my spirit. You will carry my name to the very places you tried to erase it. This is your new mission. I was being given a choice. Not just life over death, but purpose over emptiness. The old Kellen, the king of nothing, had to stay dead in this void. If I came back, I would be someone else entirely. If you were given a second chance like that. A complete reset. What is the one thing from your old life you would be most afraid of leaving behind? You want to know what it felt like to wake up in my own body again? A completely changed man. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. The story of my first day of a new life is coming next. It was the kind of choice that isn't really a choice at all. Stay here in this peaceful, all-knowing light or go back to a world of pain and brokenness. But the choice wasn't about comfort, it was about purpose. The old Kellen, the king of shadows, was dead. He had died in that bed and his soul was being held here in this divine courtroom. To go back meant leaving him behind forever. My answer wasn't a word. I had no mouth to speak it. It was a feeling. A complete and total surrender. It was the feeling of a soldier finally laying down a weapon he's been forced to carry his entire life. It was the feeling of a prisoner turning the key to his own cell and walking out into the sun. I gave my consent. I gave my yes. Not just to the mission, but to him. All of me. The broken parts, the darkness, the shame. I laid it all at the center of that light, and I felt it being accepted. The light pulsed, a final, blinding confirmation. And then the voice gave me one last instruction, a thought that burned itself into the fabric of my new soul. The world you are returning to will not understand you, it said, the thought both a promise and a warning. The darkness you commanded will now see you as an enemy. Your old allies will become your new foes. You will be weak, but my strength will be made perfect in your weakness. Do not speak of your own power. Speak only of mine. Go, and be afraid of nothing. And with that final command, the universe turned inside out. It wasn't a gentle float back to my body. It was a violent, instantaneous pull. It felt like being dragged backward through a hurricane of color and sound. The peaceful silence of the void was shattered by a rushing roar. The warm, golden light fractured into a billion shards of sensory information. I felt the memory of touch, the echo of taste, the ghost of smell, all flooding back at once. It was a brutal, shocking re-entry into the physical world, then a jolt. It felt like a lightning strike, a defibrillator shocking a dead heart back to life. But it was my soul slamming back into my body. The first thing I felt wasn't the cancer. The fire in my gut was gone. The first thing I felt was the rough, starchy texture of a cheap blanket against my chin. The first thing I smelled was antiseptic. The first sound I heard wasn't the voice of God. It was the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. My heart. Strong. Steady. Alive. I took a breath. A real one. Not the shallow, rattling struggle of a dying man, but a deep, clean, powerful gasp that filled my lungs with the stale, recycled air of a hospital room. It was the single most precious thing I had ever possessed. My eyelids, which had felt like lead weights just an eternity ago, fluttered open. The light was harsh, fluorescent. The world was blurry at first, then sharpened into focus. I saw the white-tiled ceiling, the fourth drip stand next to my bed. A nurse, her back to me, writing on a clipboard. I was back. The monster was gone. I was a new creation, a ghost inhabiting the life of a man who deserved to be dead. Have you ever felt so completely changed on the inside that you barely recognized the person looking back at you in the mirror? If you want to hear what happened when the doctors came in and saw the miracle they couldn't explain, and the first person I went to see after I walked out of that hospital, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. The story of my first steps as a free man is next. The nurse turned around and a little scream escaped her lips. And the clipboard she was holding clattered to the polished floor, scattering papers like dead leaves. Within seconds, my room was a storm of blue scrubs and white coats. They descended on me, a flurry of urgent professional panic. They shone lights in my eyes, checked the monitor that was now beeping with a strong, steady rhythm, and fired questions at me that I didn't have the words to answer. Through it all, I was perfectly calm. I felt a peace so profound it was almost a physical weight anchoring me to the bed while chaos swirled around me. I just watched them. I watched the lead doctor, a man who had told me with grave certainty that I had less than a week to live, stare at a new set of scans on a tablet. He kept looking from the screen to me, then back to the screen. His mouth was a thin, tight line, his brow furrowed not with concern, but with complete, utter disbelief. He looked like a master clockmaker staring at a watch he had declared broken, now ticking perfectly on its own. He finally looked at me, his professional mask completely gone. "Mr. Kale, what happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I just looked back at him, and for the first time in my adult life, I told the simple, unvarnished truth. "God," I said. He just shook his head and walked out of the room, leaving a wake of confused silence behind him. They released me 2 days later, calling it a spontaneous remission of an unprecedented nature. They used a lot of big words to say one simple thing. They had no idea. My driver, a man who had worked for me for 10 years and had never seen me smile, picked me up. The ride back to my mansion was the most awkward silence I have ever experienced. I just stared out the window of the armored limousine. The sun felt warmer. The green of the trees seemed more alive. I saw the faces of people on the street, really saw them, not as obstacles or insects, but as people. I had lived my entire life inside a fortress of my own making, and now that the king was dead, the prisoner was finally seeing the world for the first time. Walking through the front doors of my house was like walking into a stranger's mausoleum. The towering marble walls, the cold modern art, the gold fixtures I had chosen to project power, it all felt hollow, cheap. My staff, who used to flatten themselves against the walls when I walked by, now just stared. Their fear was gone, replaced by a deep, unnerving confusion. They were looking at the same body, the same face, but they knew, on some primal level, that the man who had left this house to die was not the man who had just returned. I went to my bedroom and stood in front of a mirror that was larger than most people's dining tables. I saw my face, healthier than it had been in years, but it was my eyes that held my attention. The cold, dead hardness was gone. In its place was a light, a peace. It was the face of a stranger, and I wept. But the real test came that night. I was sitting in my vast, silent office, the one where I had sealed the fates of so many men. The private line, the one only a handful of people in the world had the number to, began to ring. I knew who it would be. I picked it up. The voice on the other end was slick with the familiar arrogance of power. It was a government minister, one of my most loyal puppets. He didn't even say hello. "Kellen," he said, "I have a problem. A journalist. He's digging too close. I need him to have an accident." The old me would have named my price. Old me would have felt that familiar thrill of control, of holding another man's life in my hands. But the old me was dead. I took a breath, and a voice I barely recognized as my own came out of my mouth. It was quiet. It was calm. And it held a power that my old self could have never dreamed of. "Can't do that for you anymore, Thomas," I said gently. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "But I will pray for you," I continued. "I will pray that God softens your heart and helps you find a better way." He didn't say another word. He just hung up. And in that moment I knew. That single phone call was a new declaration of war. I had just walked away from the table, and the darkness does not take kindly to deserters. What do you think is harder, dying to your old self or having to live as the new one when the world only remembers the monster you used to be? If you want to find out what happened when my old allies became my most dangerous enemies, and the first step I took on my new mission, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. The battle had only just begun. I placed the phone back in its cradle with a quiet click. The sound was so small, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a kingdom falling, of a lifetime of dark alliances turning to ash. I half expected the walls to shake, for demons to tear through the floorboards. But there was nothing. Just a profound, peaceful silence that filled the room. A silence that felt holy. The war one had declared on my old life was over in a single, quiet surrender. And for the first time, I wasn't the king. I was just free. The next morning, I made another call. Not to a politician or a banker, but to a liquidator. Men in crisp suits, the kind I used to intimidate, walked through my mansion with clipboards, putting price tags on my life. They tagged the $1 million paintings, the fleet of cars, the gold leaf furniture. They watched them dismantle my empire piece by piece, and with every item that left, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. It was like shedding a skin I had been trapped in for decades. My staff watched me, their faces a mix of confusion and pity. They thought I had lost my mind. The truth was, I had just found it. With the last of the money, I bought a simple, used truck and a map. There was one debt left to pay, one that couldn't be settled with cash. I drove for 2 days, back to the dusty village at the foot of the cliff where my old fortress stood. I found him not in a church, but working in a small community garden, his hands covered in dirt, the young pastor, the one whose face I could never forget. When he saw me, he didn't flinch. He just straightened up, wiped his hands on his pants, and waited. His eyes held no fear, no anger, only a quiet, patient curiosity. I walked toward him, and every step felt like a mile. The man who once commanded armies of influence couldn't find the words to speak to this simple gardener. So I did the only thing I could. I fell to my knees in the dirt in front of him. I, Kellen, who had made powerful men kneel before me, knelt in the dust at the feet of a servant of God. I couldn't even look at his face. I just bowed my head in shame and wept. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't deserve it. I just cried out all the poison that was left inside me. After a moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was gentle, but strong. "Get up, brother," he said, his voice soft. "The man who did those things is dead. I see a new man standing before me." He pulled me to my feet and wrapped his arms around me, and in that embrace I felt the last of my prison walls crumble to dust. My new mission wasn't glamorous. It started with a hammer. I stayed in that village, and I used the last of my fortune to help them build the very church I had tried to prevent. My hands, once soft and accustomed only to signing checks and holding glasses of scotch, became calloused and raw. I learned to mix concrete. I learned to lay bricks. I learned the names of the people, heard their stories, shared their simple meals. The hollowness inside me, the vast, cold emptiness, was being filled, one conversation, one shared laugh at a time. I was discovering that true power wasn't in commanding people, but in serving them. Then came the day I learned what God's power really meant. An old woman in the village had been confined to a wheelchair for years, her legs twisted with pain. As I was passing by her small hut, I felt a nudge, a gentle but insistent push in my spirit. "Pray for her," I froze. Me? I was a builder, a laborer, not a healer. I was the monster who had brought them pain. But the feeling was undeniable. Trembling, I walked over to her, knelt down again, and placed my clumsy, dirty hands on her legs. I didn't know any fancy prayers. I just closed my eyes and said, Jesus, please, heal her. A warmth spread from my hands, a clean electric heat that startled me. The woman gasped. Her eyes flew open. Slowly, shakily, she stood up from her chair. The whole village saw it. I saw it. And I knew, with a certainty that shook my soul, that this was the power the voice had promised. It had nothing to do with me. I was just the wire. He was the electricity. If you had the chance to go back and fix the single biggest mistake of your life, but it meant giving up everything you had, would you do it? If you want to hear about the first time the darkness I abandoned came looking for me, and the impossible battle that followed, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. You have no idea what's coming next. That feeling, it was nothing like the dark, commanding power I used to wield. That old power was heavy. It was a weight I had to carry, a beast I constantly had to feed with rituals and fear. This new power was light. It flowed through me, not from me. I was just a hollow reed, and the music was coming from somewhere else. For the first time in my life, I was a part of something that was infinitely bigger than myself, and the feeling wasn't control. It was peace. I spent my entire life building a kingdom of shadows, believing that what I could control was what made me rich. I was wrong. I was the poorest man on earth, trapped in a prison of my own making, surrounded by meaningless, expensive junk. I learned, with calloused hands and an aching back, that you're not rich because of what you have in your bank account. You're rich because of what you're willing to give away. My old power took things from people, their hope, their businesses, their lives. This new power gives. It restores. It heals. I spent $1 million to erase a name, and in return, that name gave me a new life. I tried to buy silence, and he answered with a symphony of grace. It turns out the greatest bargain I ever made wasn't with some dark entity in a candlelit room. It was when I traded my entire worthless kingdom for a single moment of his mercy. I was a warlord who declared war on heaven, and I lost in the most beautiful way imaginable. So I have to ask you, after hearing all this, what does it truly mean to be powerful in this world? If this story has touched you, and if you believe that no one is too lost to be found, let me know in the comments. My journey was far from over, and the darkness I abandoned didn't just let me walk away. Subscribe and ring that bell, because in the next video, I'm going to share the story of the first time my old life came hunting for my new one. You won't want to miss it.